Hello and welcome. I'm Joy Williamson-Lott, Dean of the University of Washington Graduate School, home of the Office of Public Lectures. I want to thank you for joining us for tonight's Graduate School Public Lecture titled Protests for the Soul of a Nation, COVID-19, Black Lives Matter, and Election 2020 with UW faculty member Dr. Ming Francis. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the many departments and people who helped make this live stream possible, including UW Communication Leadership, the Department of Political Science, the Population Health Initiative, and our talented live stream production team and graduate school staff. Thank you. I also want to thank you for your continued loyalty as viewers of these great live streams. We know it's not the same experience as what our in-person lectures offered. One day, we will get to see one another in person, and I know our team in the Office of Public Lectures is really looking forward to seeing you too. Now, I'd like to tell you a little bit about our speaker, Dr. Francis. Dr. Francis is an associate professor of political science at the University of Washington and a fellow at the Carr Center for Human Rights at the Harvard Kennedy School. Dr. Francis specializes in the study of American politics with broad interests in criminal punishment, Black political activism, philanthropy, and the post-Civil War South. She is the author of the award-winning book, Civil Rights and the Making of the Modern American State. Dr. Francis is a proud alumnus of Seattle Public Schools, Rice University in Houston, and Princeton University, where she received her MA and PhD in politics. Once again, thank you for joining us and enjoy the lecture.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Ming Francis. I'm a professor here in the Political Science Department at the University of Washington. I want to thank the graduate school. Also, I want to thank Dean Joy Williamson for that generous introduction, to Molly Mandeltort, the UW Alumni Association, and I also want to recognize the incredible work of Yvette Moy, who is the fearless leader and curator of the Grad Lecture Series. It is the privilege of a lifetime to teach at the University of Washington and to work with such exciting colleagues and students. But most of all, at least right now, I'm grateful to all of you who have taken time out of your busy day, who are clearly over-Zoomed in this moment and clearly over kind of the sensories in terms of politics, to gather in community online and to listen to me tonight. So a virtual high five to y'all. And I want to acknowledge right now, and I'll probably say this at the end, I've been fortunate enough to do a number of these talks with the UW Graduate School, and one of the things I enjoy so much is my interaction with you all, and doing kind of a very long, extended Q&A. So we can't be together in person, but I look forward to a future date in which we can. All right, also, before I move on into my talk, I want to say if you have any questions, because we can't do that in person and I can't call on you in person, if you have any questions, I am taking questions at the end of the talk. Please email mayiask@uw.edu. One more time, and I think it's on the screen, mayiask@uw.edu. Okay, with that, let's start. So first, I want to acknowledge the anxiety of the moment and the sheer impossibility of adequately addressing the title of my talk, right? Today, I said that I was going to perhaps talk about COVID-19, BLM protests, and the election. In part because that is everything that is going on in my mind right now. I can't do all of that justice, but I will, and I'm using this talk as a way to think through historic events that have taken place this year that touch on everything that is important to me. It strikes me, as an opening thought, that the thing that people have been running from the most is violence. More precisely, the structuring role of violence in American society. The violence that led to the establishment of this country, the violence of genocide of indigenous nations, the violence that led to the end of slavery, and of course, the persisting violence of racism. And instead of honestly reckoning with the past, we have sanitized it through a curious mythology that obscures rather than illuminates the reasons behind deep power differentials and disparities in our society. Today, we have the audacity to act surprised that a country founded on the plunder of indigenous nations and built by the labor of enslaved black people is still violent and racist. We can and should understand how this foundational moment has structured everything else, and then we should do something about it. Take action to help right this wrong. The central question that I find myself landing on and returning to throughout this year, and after each episode of what I will call the crazy, is who do I want to be as an individual, and who do we want to be as a country? It's a futuristic, of course, type of question. It calls me, I think it calls us, to think beyond the here and now. Who do we want implies that I am not and we are not the greatest versions of ourselves. But it also suggests the process of becoming the final form, what some of my sci-fi friends might say, of who I can be is not yet over. I choose to focus on who do we want to be because who we have become is clearly untenable. This year has showed us who we are, a nation with a massively unequal healthcare system, a racist and violent police force, millions of Americans who teeter on the edge of food and housing insecurity, and rising levels of authoritarianism. Every month, week, and now day brings new horrors. COVID outbreaks in schools, increasing homelessness, voter disenfranchisement, and these long, terrible lines. It has gotten so bad that to cope, kind of a ritual for many has been to say, throw 2020, the whole of it, away. And I get it. This year is not just untenable. It's soul-crushing, it's scary, it's violent. 2020 has been all of those things, and yet the events of this year have also showed us that another world is possible. People have come together in ways that I couldn't have imagined 1 year ago, in mutual aid for their communities, our public health professionals risking their lives to save ours, in solidarity in the form of righteous indignation and marches against institutional racism. Together, people across this nation, poor and wealthy, non-citizen and citizen, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, and white, have started to build a new world. The present may not be the world we want, but it's clear that people still got a lot of fight in them for something different. But what does this other world look like? I tell my students all the time that how you see the world shapes what you believe needs to be done to fix it. It strikes me that the first step in building the world we want should begin with an understanding and analysis of what went wrong in the first place to ensure we build things different next time. Another way of putting it is if the house is on fire, and clearly it is, then before you can rebuild that house, you gotta figure out what was the cause of the fire. If you don't, the house is just gonna burn down again. And the rest of my talk, I'm going to focus on trying to understand what happened this year, because before we can address the question, who do we want to be, we need to first answer the question, who do we not want to be? The problem that we see today did not begin, the many problems that we see today did not begin with COVID-19, nor did they begin in May with the murder of George Floyd. They didn't even begin with Trump. I know, that's real hard to believe, but just stay with me. So let me say this again a little bit more explicitly. All the problems that were laid bare, laid bare in ways, right? Laid bare in 2020 were around before 2020. It's just that many people chose not to see them. We are a nation that has been running from its history and its present. Every time a politician said something in the past like, this is not who we are, a chorus of people shouted back, this is always who we were. Whether it was Charlottesville, whether it was child detention and kids in cages. The great African-American scholar, W.E.B. Du Bois, tells us that a system cannot fail those it was never meant to protect. The system as it currently operates does not provide justice and safety, nor does it treat people equally because it was never meant to. The ugly reality of who we are has been laid bare, and who we are is this: a nation with a manifestly unequal healthcare system and law enforcement that treat people of color as violent threats to the social order. We say COVID-19 affected all of us and significantly changed our way of life. And there was this unique moment that I'll never forget for the rest of my life in March and April of the year 2020, of national anxiety and collective suffering, when it seemed that the virus could infect any of us. Tom Hanks got it, remember that? Right, like that was the moment we were like, if Tom Hanks and Rita Wilson got it, we can get it too. It was supposed to be proof that COVID-19 does not discriminate. But then April went, and we collectively watched something else. COVID ripped through and ravaged Black, Indigenous, and Latinx communities. The loss of life has been staggering. In Minnesota, where George Floyd lived, Black Americans in May, and these are statistics from May at the time, accounted for and still account for 6% of the population, but 14% of the COVID-19 cases and 33% of the COVID-19 deaths. Rhode Island, I know, Latinx residents account for 13% of the population, but 59% of positive COVID cases. In New Orleans, Black residents accounted for a harrowing 77% of COVID-19 deaths. The COVID tracking project is a great place for those interested in following the race and ethnicity data around COVID infection rates and death, and this is part of the slide here. Overall, the COVID tracking project details that nationwide, Black people are dying at 2.3 times the rate of white people. The statistics that so many of us followed revealed an ugly truth. COVID-19, the virus, perhaps does not discriminate, but structural racism has created the conditions through which certain communities will be disproportionately impacted. And what I mean by this is that persisting health disparities impact access to adequate health care, impact the quality of health care, impact the delivery of services, but also, and perhaps most importantly, impact the underlying environmental conditions that make one more or less susceptible to illness. Black and Latinx people are more likely to live near waste sites and thus more likely to be exposed to toxins and pollutants. A disproportionate number of Black and Latinx and Indigenous communities do not have drinkable water and also have higher rates of asthma, diabetes, and cancer. Racism is, as a team of researchers, including UW-Medicine's own Edwin Lindo, described in a recent article, quote, racism is a fundamental cause of disease and the strange but familiar root of racial health inequities, end quote. COVID-19 didn't just reveal deep health disparities, it stopped people from running from the truth, literally. I have an unproven theory, roll with me, I'm a social scientist. So I have an unproven theory that part of the reason the Black Lives Matter protests felt different this time, I keep on hitting my mic here. The reason why the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020 felt different is because people couldn't run anymore. I used to participate in these webinars and I would get these questions again and again. Do they feel different this time? Why do they feel different this time? And so I've been thinking about this question a lot. And I have come to that I think that white people in this country have always wanted to run from their culpability and complicity in upholding racist structures. That this country is racist is not new, of course. It's not even new to conservatives. But racism has often seemed so overwhelming that well-intentioned people have acknowledged it but done nothing actively to fix it because there is no time and because there are so many other things to do. But this time in 2020, there was nowhere to go, nowhere to escape because COVID made it so that the normal places of refuge, of shelter, of congregation were closed. There were no recitals, there were no long champagne brunches, right? Most office places were shuttered. The performing arts, the wonderful theater, ballet, and opera shut down. It was you at home with your screens, your family, God help y'all, and all of the news, and nowhere to go but to face the truth of being a citizen in a nation where law enforcement can murder innocent Americans because of the color of their skin. And the victim's last words caught on video because the killing happened in broad daylight. The murder of George Floyd was not the first time an innocent black person has been killed by the police. There was Breonna Taylor, of course, in March, Stephon Clark, Freddie Gray, Philando Castile, pulled over for a traffic stop in 2016, Alton Sterling for selling CDs and DVDs in Louisiana, and of course, Eric Garner in 2014, who died in a chokehold saying, "I can't breathe," 11 times. And so many more. The most recent data collected by the organization, and this is on the slide, Mapping Police Violence, and I encourage, if you're interested in some of the recent data, to go there, reveals that black people are 3 times more likely to be killed by police than white people. There is a crisis of enormous proportions in the areas of policing and incarceration in the United States. The history of racialized policing in this country is long. In my current book project, I'm actually documenting the emergence of a more formalized criminal punishment system in policing in the American South with an explicit focus on the 2 states, Alabama and Texas. And what's fascinating about what happens in terms of the end, right, the end of the Civil War, and the freeing of black people in the South. At the same time that Reconstruction is going on, Southern politicians are figuring out how to entrap black people again. And what they go to is the law. They rewrite the criminal code. They then practice through a racialized policing. They then get more, through a race-based policing, more than arrest of black people. In terms of through all white juries, very, very, very quick trials. And what you see in most states, as soon as the Civil War ends, is a dramatic shift in the population, who would be the jail or the penitentiary population all across the American South. So there's this much longer history of racialized policing in this country that's important to pay attention to. So I want to just pause here in terms of kind of meditate on this for a moment. That a group of Americans encounter a vastly different police force than others and pay the ultimate price of death, not just in 2020, but over the long durée of American history. Black people have shown that racism is deadly for generations. And it was not until a global pandemic pushed everyone indoors and shut down all of the activities that a much wider population of Americans came to learn more, were outraged, and committed themselves to making change. I may be critical of how long it took a lot of Americans to get here, but I am thankful that many have arrived. All right, so this then I want to segue to a different section I'm calling the fix, protest, and elections. Unsatisfied with who we had become, families, communities, small towns ask the question, who do we want to be? We need to know who we want to be so we know what we are fighting for, and fight people did. For nearly 3 straight months during the spring and summer of 2020, thousands of protesters and rebellions exploded across this country. More than 20 million people of all races, from large cities to rural locales, some that were majority white, have marched and protested in a defiant display of public mourning and righteous outrage, demanding accountability for the brazen murder of countless black people at the hands of law enforcement. Their voices, their bodies, and their imaginations have awakened a sleepy nation to the urgency of addressing deeply entrenched racial injustice. Public opinion data, one second here. Public opinion data confirmed this shift, noting in June and July that it had shifted dramatically in support of the Black Lives Matter movement. Polling data now indicates a majority of Americans believe that the police are more likely to use deadly force against African Americans, and that there's a lot of discrimination, this is another poll, a lot of discrimination against Black Americans in society. The shift in public opinion feels surreal. As somebody who has spent an entire career focused on Black politics and Black protests, I cannot describe to you the feeling of 2020. Let's remember that in 2014, if we look at polling data, many white Americans thought acceptable to debate the phrase Black Lives Matter, right? Why can't I say all lives matter? It was a question that I even received in a lecture, in the grad lecture series in 2017. Fast forward now to the present, where members of Congress and police officers take a knee, raise a fist, and proclaim Black Lives Matter in a public performance of solidarity with protesters. Perhaps most important, Black protesters call to reimagine justice, defund the police, and reinvest in community programs, all of which were once considered radical ideas, have suddenly made their way into the mainstream of American public thought and action. I'll never forget the shock I felt. This is a recent story. The shock I felt when Chris Wallace from Fox News asked the question at a presidential debate, "What does reimagining police mean?" End quote. I had to go to the transcript to make sure that is exactly what he asked, Trump and Biden. Now, both candidates did not answer the question well. As my students would say, they didn't have the range. But it marks an important moment that would have been inconceivable even last year. The rhetoric of Black Lives Matter protesters had made their way into the vocabulary of a Fox News journalist on a national debate stage. Protests centered around the protection of Black lives have brought this nation to its knees. For millions of Americans, the protests have come as a surprise, but they are not. The current transformative moment is built on the legacies and work of previous Black protest moments. And it's very important to understand that we don't get a Black Lives Matter protest in 2020 without the protest after the Zimmerman acquittal for killing Trayvon Martin in 2012, or the Ferguson uprising in 2014, or Baltimore Black Lives Matter protests in 2017. But it goes back even further than the 21st century establishment of the movement for Black lives. The long Black freedom struggle developed the political language, strategies, and organizing infrastructure that has culminated in the present moment. Examining this longer lineage of Black protest movements is critical in helping us all understand how we arrived where we are today, the timeline of struggle, and the urgent need to move forward with boldness in the future. In general, the American public knows little about the long tradition of Black Lives Matter protest. In 1900, the civil rights icon, Ida B. Wells, to a gathering in Chicago, delivered a stinging indictment to the nation. And she says, and this is a quote, "Our country's national crime is lynching." Wells would know best. The end of the 19th century marked the highest number of lynchings of Black people in the United States. In response, Ida B. Wells spearheaded a dramatic public education campaign around lynchings, where she collected data and wrote numerous news stories to raise awareness about what had been done to innocent Black people. At the time, lynchings of black people were justified by a widespread belief in the innate criminality of black people. Wells, however, through her investigations, told a different story, that lynching was a tool of white supremacy to maintain the total educational, economic, and social subordination of the black community. By conducting lynching investigations and writing news stories, Wells provided a mirror to white America to examine itself. And for black protests, Wells left the enduring lesson to always question state justifications for black death. Influenced by her activism, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, was formed in 1909 and launched a movement focused on protecting black lives from lynchings and mob violence. The picture of the protesters on the slide is a protest organized by the NAACP in 1917 to protest mob violence in East St. Louis. Now, a little bit of background about the NAACP. Before the NAACP focused on their historic battle against segregated education, they spent 2 decades in the early 20th century exposing the dangerous levels of racial violence endured by black people. I chronicle this in my first book, Civil Rights and the Making of the Modern American State. The book is trying to make a claim about how black citizens constructed civil rights, organized in American politics in the darkest of times. Before the landmark Brown v. Board of Education decision at the height of lynchings, abandoned by both political parties, and decades before the student sit-ins, how did the NAACP organize in a political environment that did not treat black people as complete citizens? And so what I document in my book is this long, interesting story about the NAACP and their work in Congress, their work in terms of 2 presidential administrations, their work outside, demonstrations, writing stories, as well as gaining and winning this important Supreme Court decision. Much research in political science looks to institutions and elite actors and government to explain dramatic shifts in political and constitutional development. The NAACP's movement against racist violence, however, tells a different story. It suggests that bottom-up protests can meaningfully change the actions taken by political institutions and make government more accountable to citizens. The key takeaway, or I hope the key takeaway from my research, is that protest in conjunction with pressure inside of political and legal institutions is necessary to reduce racial violence. Historically, black protest has served as a kind of testimony to the nation's most vulnerable in its ability to expose the bankruptcy of a country that has failed repeatedly at offering equal justice and equality to all of its citizens. In this moment, thinking about the present and the past, I've been thinking a lot about another moment of mass protests, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963. It was there that Martin Luther King delivered his now, of course, iconic speech, "I Have a Dream." And he says here, and I want to use this long quote here, so please excuse me, but I think it's just so powerful, especially for this moment. He says, "In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. And so we have come to cash this check, a check that will give us, upon demand, the riches of freedom and the security of justice. And then we have also come to this hollowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now." End quote. We need a politics of liberation rooted in the experience of oppressed peoples. We need to understand that true freedom has always been about people on the margins, exposing the contradictions in who we purport to be and who we actually are. Ida B. Wells knew, the NAACP knew, King knew. Today's courageous Black Lives Matter protesters know The system is not made to protect Black lives, and the only way we will survive is if we organize and create the conditions where we can live. That is the only option. The purpose of past protests, the purpose of contemporary protest, is to tell a story to the public about the true nature of our society. And that has normally triggered, and sometimes, a reaction from the state. Black protest movements have historically been, and this is what I said when I was discussing Ida B. Wells, about holding a mirror up to this nation and working within and around institutions that have never treated them as full citizens. In doing so, they have helped this country answer the question, who do we want to be? But Black protesters cannot go at this alone. They can win, but it's going to take all of us. It's also true that white people need to take up the struggle for racial justice as their own struggle, not as charity, but as a committed struggle. Being in solidarity, which I know many people probably who might be watching think they are, being in solidarity does not mean just reading a book or a donation. That, of course, can and should be part of it. It means every day doing the work, using your power and privilege to end your power and privilege. Showing up differently for colleagues and for friends and for community members. And there are so many ways we can do this. Of course, protesting is not for everyone, but people need to show up differently this time. Many people want to end structural racism, but don't want to change anything about the privileges that they have. They want to tweak the edges and hold the middle. You want to know where that has gotten us? Right here in this hellscape of an election period that we are in. We are in the fight for our lives. I do not want to spend any time focused on the negligent person in the White House, but I will say this, that elections offer us a chance to decide who we want to be. The last 18 months of get out the vote efforts have energized me more than I can remember. Big cities, and especially in suburban and rural towns, people are coming together to vote Trump out and to push the Democrat Party to think more about what a truly inclusive party might actually look like. This is my last slide. So this is a friend and a colleague and a hero. This is Ms. LaTosha Brown, one of the co-founders of an incredible organization called Black Voters Matter, and believes passionately that a radical reimagination of America is possible. Mainstream political organizing has written off much of the Black South because of low voter registration numbers, preferring instead to cling to a narrative about their voter apathy. Ms. Brown refuses this, first by acknowledging that it is a rational response from people who have been neglected by parties and political leaders, and then reframing the critique that many voters do not feel that the system cares about them. And instead, she suggests that we have a system that cares more about voting than about voters. Those are her words, not mine. Her focus is from moving from a transactional type of politics to a transformative type of politics where we actually listen and hear each other and have honest conversations about the tools available to all of us to create change in our world, voting being just one of the tools in that toolbox. And this is where I want to end. We have spent so much time trying to hold up what does not work in our political and legal universe, plugging up holes in a sinking ship, bordering up a leaked roof of a house. The past 4 years, and especially the last year, if I can be thankful of anything, it is that the last 4 years has made the effective argument that it's not working. Today, I believe that we are at an inflection moment. History tells us that when things crumble, when they fall, when the house burns down, there is an opportunity to rebuild something from the ashes. The question here is, do you build it the same or do you build a whole new house? to finally answer the question, who do we want to be? I hope that we want to be a nation that protects the ability of people to live a full life, to have quality education, to have access to health care and mental illness care, to not live in fear of the police. I think these are majoritarian ideas. I also think that these are winning ideas for all of us. Thank you so much. I look forward to the Q&A. All right, so I have some Q&A here, and a number of questions. So first, actually, I want to say there's a lot of questions. I'm not going to be able to address all of the questions. I want to thank everybody for the engagement and for submitting a question. I'm going to try to do what I can. Okay. Oh, I love this question. Okay, so this question from an audience member. Since you work with students, what kind of information are you getting from them about who they want to be? I love this. I did not plan for this to be the case, but this week in my U.S. Courts and Civil Liberties class, if there's any students here, hey. In my U.S. Courts and Civil Liberties class, we focused on protest. And today I conducted a few poll everywheres where I asked students if they had engaged in protest and what types of protests did they actually engage in. And it struck me that the majority of students in my class had engaged in some type of protest. Black Lives Matter, perhaps climate, perhaps the Women's March, perhaps something else. But in terms of the information I'm getting from students in the class that I'm teaching online, as well as information that I've gotten from previous students in different classes, is they want a world in which that themselves, their families, and their friends are able to live safe lives. They want a world where if you work one job, you can provide food for your family and a roof over your head, right? That we shouldn't be in 2020 and have a working poor, people who work 2 to 3 jobs and still cannot put food on the table. I mean, it strikes me that so many of my students, in part because I teach political science and kind of like pre-law classes, want to go and change the world. And at the end of the day, the thing that for me connects them all is that they want to feel safe. Okay. Man, it's hard without you guys here. Okay. In terms of, another question here is about funding. This is something that I know some of you guys know that I have spent a lot of time over the past few years focused on. This question from the audience member here is, there has been significant increase in donations to Black Lives Matter related organizations. Why did it take until 2020 to receive this level of financial support? So this is fascinating in part because I was focused on trying to understand the role of funders in 1960 civil rights struggle and the impact of funders on the agenda of Black protest movements, as well as the strategy, development, and formation of Black civil rights organizations. I had also been kind of following what had been happening over the past few years of the Black Lives Matter movement. But what happened in 2020 was a massive influx and increase in terms of donations. Now, it should have always been at this level, right? Like, it should have always been this level. But this has, in terms of individual donations, corporate donations, as well as foundation-committed support to the Black Lives Matter organizations and organizations affiliated with Black Lives Matter, as well as to broadly conceived racial justice organizations. And I think that part of the reason why it took this long is I'm almost positive that many people understood policing and systemic and structural racism as this much of a problem. I think this moment, this year, has really made clear that in order to address other areas that we care about, that in order to address education, in order to have healthy workplaces, right? In order to, if you're focused on environmental justice, that you can't do these things well unless you address structural racism. That's always gonna limit the impact that you have. It's always going to blunt the impact, right? And so what we've seen this year is that there's clearly always been people that have been focused on these structures, and that you have now in this moment, at least, people who are like, yo, you know what? Let's figure out like this right here. And to me, it's somewhat exciting in the sense that I've often taught, not I have often, but last year taught Black Lives Matter, but specifically prison abolition as a type of policy innovation. And I don't think it's like thought to be as such, but I think that what also happened in this moment in 2020 was a reframing and a centering of what had previously been fringe or considered radical ideas more moved to the center. Because what has been clear is that what people had been doing and what people had been funding was not working. Okay. Let's see, what else? It seems, okay, hold on. There's another question here. Do you think the Black Lives Matter movement is a continuation of unfinished business from the civil rights movement? And what do you think Black Lives Matter will be able to successfully accomplish, and what will be unfinished business? Okay, this is a big question. I'm gonna try to do part of this question here. I think in so many ways, and I wanna answer this question because I think it's important to talk about our understanding of the timeline of what it will take for significant change to actually happen. So yes, I think that 2020 is a continuation of 2017, is a continuation of 2015. I think that 2020 is a continuation of the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s civil rights organizing. It's clear to me, and there's been a bit of scholarship, two colleagues and I think wonderful thinkers, Dorian Warren, who is the president of Center for Community Change, and Sabeel Rahman, who's the president of Demos. They have co-written, I think, a really interesting article that wants to think about, is this moment perhaps a third Reconstruction? And so if we know that in terms of the moment after the end of enslavement is the first Reconstruction, and this period in the 1960s with the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 65 and the Civil Rights Act of 64 is considered a second Reconstruction. And kind of the second Reconstruction focuses on a type of reform, right? And that part of the problem is that there's these Jim Crow laws, and that African Americans, Black people, people of color, women are being kept outside of these structures. So let's change these institutions and change these laws, right? So that African Americans and people of color can be more part of that. What seems to be going on, and why some people, there's also Reverend William Barber, thinking about this as perhaps a third Reconstruction moment, is in terms of, because that fight, right, in terms of the protection of lives as well as rights for Black people is still there. But in this moment, we have this expansive, transformative thinking, imagining of activists in this moment, right? That what's clear is that, like, let's try to figure out if these laws, the constitutional laws and this system can actually treat Black people as full people. Oh, it can. We still have all these problems. Well, then we actually might need to dismantle some of these institutions today. That's what people are saying. Okay, I think I have one more question. Okay, there's so many good questions, you guys. Until I get the notice from the big people, then I'll do one more. Okay, two more. Okay, I'm gonna try to do one quick, and then I'm gonna do another one. How has social media changed the protest movement? This is an exciting one. It's changed it in a lot of ways, right? It's made information. It's the ability for people to access information. It has kind of limited the cost, at least in terms of people can publish and get their ideas out. They can organize through Twitter, through Facebook now. But in the same time, one of the things that I always talk about, I think there are a lot of benefits in things and ways that social media has made organizing a bit smoother and has limited kind of the barriers to entry. But it's also important to think about the types of also harassment faced by organizers and activists as a result of social media. That in this moment, that people of color and women of color especially are targeted by very vicious statements by people online. So I think that's also something that part of the backlash now that seemingly would happen in person now happens online, but that doesn't make the threat of it and the fear of anything any less. Okay, how many do I have? One more? I'm looking at my team, everybody. Okay, you guys shouldn't say this, because I will. All right, okay. As Americans, so this question is, and I'll end here, As Americans continue the work of dismantling racist systems, what lessons should be remembered from past movements? Whew, there's a lot. I think one that I've been thinking about over the past few months as we've gone into this, we've moved from the summer into this fall period, one of the lessons strikes me is that protest in the streets and demonstrations in the streets is vitally important. That you don't get dramatic change in this country without protest in the streets. You can't, I mean, if we look at the expanse of history, it's just not possible. Protest creates openings. Even for those who are kind of strict institutionalists, protest on the outside creates pressures on our formal institutions, okay? So, but I've been thinking a lot about protest in the streets as we move into this fall, and one of the lessons, I think that an important lesson coming out of early 20th century and mid 20th century is the importance of connecting protest in the streets with also changing and movement inside of formal politics. That you need both. That yes, protest, yes, we should still be in the streets demanding change. Before this election, and especially after this election, win or lose, need to figure out how do we push structures in government? How do we build power for marginalized people? For people of color, how do we build power in politics? So that to me, I think right now there's been kind of a big focus on protests and demonstrations, but I think that there also needs to be also a focus on how might we actually work inside of electoral institutions. It also strikes me that one of the lessons that seemingly I think is learned in this moment that is to me really exciting is that you need more women leaders. That seems to be one of the lessons of the early 20th century as well as mid 20th century civil rights movement. It's not that there wasn't women leaders in the 1960s, black women leaders. There were, but there wasn't in part because of the gender dynamics at the time, right? Many people do not know who somebody as important as Ella Baker was. Now today, in this moment, it's clear, right, that this movement in terms of is being led by black queer women. And so that seems to be an important lesson about the past, to trust black women, as well with movements, as well as with the election. All right, I'm gonna leave it there. I wanna thank everybody for spending part of your, Wednesday? Part of your Wednesday with me. You know, I wouldn't be a political science professor if I did not tell you to please go and vote. The last thing that I will say is I am somebody that believes voting is very important, but voting is not the only thing that we can do. And so that you can not maybe perhaps knock on doors, but phone bank, talk to your neighbors, talk to your family members. There are all different types of political engagement and mobilization that we can do right now. I am excited and nervous for November. I hope to see y'all on the other side. Take care. Bye.